World class, a term which we often hear pundits, fans and managers use to describe a player's performance. In the English dictionary, world class is defined as a person who is amongst the best in the world. If you asked any football fan to give an example of a player who fits the bill over recent years, any sensible answer would include Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. But it could be argued that this duo reached such an extreme stratosphere, it's almost left a feeling of unfair judgment for players who simply cannot attain their levels of greatness. To put their dominance into perspective, between 2008 to 2023, only Luka Modric and Karim Benzema were able to knock the pair off of the Ballon d'Or throne. So now here we are in 2025. The two-horse race is over, and the field of judgment for labelling players world class has never been so divided. Even last year's Ballon d'Or caused massive dispute, as Vinicius Jr. and all of his Real Madrid representatives decided not to attend the event after finding out that Rodri would be awarded the honour. Then we recently had Sir Alex Ferguson naming the players he coached who he believed were world class, with David Beckham himself agreeing that he wasn't one of them. TV pundits have continued to debate this topic, and it's been interesting to see ex-players sharing their own tough viewpoints towards players who are still playing to this current day. So it's clear to see that the whole argument is one big mess, with no one seeming to be able to come to a universal agreement. With that being said, in this video I'm going to highlight and examine the criteria which I believe are relevant when it comes to labelling players world class. And then towards the end of the video, I'm going to create my own 33-man world class squad. So one of the biggest arguments I see being used to either justify or dispute a player being placed in the world class category is how many major trophies have they won. Now this is an argument which I certainly feel has relevance, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is the defining factor. In recent years, the likes of PSG, Real Madrid and Manchester City have won the Champions League. So would you then say that every single one of those outfield players involved are now world class? I personally wouldn't, and I feel like there needs to be more flexibility when we consider the criteria needed for labelling players world class. We all know how long it took for Harry Kane to win a major trophy, and I believe he's a big reason to why this topic is so heavily debated within the modern game. But for me, he would still be world class right now, even if he still didn't have a trophy to his name. Now of course, players should be competing in the highest of competitions against the best of players. But one individual player cannot drag their team into this position. Now the counter argument is that if a player is truly world class, why haven't they been signed up by a top club that competes at the highest level? But I would say that it's not always as simple as that. Using Harry Kane as an example again, we all remember that summer where Manchester City pushed to sign him, but Tottenham's ownership would simply not budge on the fee. And so City moved on from the deal, and the following season they went on to win the treble. Maybe Kane would have led the line to achieving that, we'll never know. Let's even look at more recent times with the Gyökeres deal to Arsenal. Sporting Lisbon was so reluctant to sell him that it got to the point where Gyökeres lowered his commission to get the move sealed, and luckily for him it got over the line. But if Arsenal had have moved on, I doubt many teams in Europe would have wanted to enter that deal with Sporting, so he could have been stuck for who knows how long. Now I'm not suggesting that Gyökeres is world class, as for me I'll make that judgment at the end of this upcoming season, as he's now got the perfect platform. But my key point is that he's now got the opportunity to prove it. The next topic which I'm going to delve into is consistency and longevity. Now I feel like this is a major factor in determining a player's level, as it's crucial we separate world-class form from world-class players. Often players will go through purple patches in their careers, where whatever they do it turns to gold. This can last for a couple of matches or even throughout a season. One of the best cases of this stemmed from Marcus Rashford, who in the 2022-23 season scored 30 goals for the first time in his career. But unfortunately, he followed this up with a mediocre tally of 8 the next season. Now at the time of Rashford's peak powers, there were many who claimed that he was world class, and it's natural to think this way when a player's in form, as you don't always anticipate the drop-offs. However, this highlights the importance for us to hold back on world-class claims, as a career which is full of yo-yo spells for me doesn't earn the right to be called world-class. I personally believe that Marcus Rashford does have world-class attributes, but without consistency it means very little when focusing on the topic of this video. I know he's just made a move to Barcelona, so maybe he can turn things around, but that would require a minimum of 3 successful seasons for me to even consider him as a world-class player. It may seem harsh, but I think it's important that we're firm in this area, otherwise the world-class label completely loses its worth. If we all talk about looking back on careers which have finished, I'd say a player needs to achieve a minimum of 5 years where they perform to a world-class level for them to permanently deserve that tag. Any less than 5 years and I feel like they're just a player who showed world-class form. And there's no shame in that, but a barrier has to be put in place, otherwise we'll be calling over 100 players world-class in each generation. Those who perform to this standard for as long as 10 years, they enter into a new bracket which is the best of their era. Luka Modric is a perfect example of showing how crucial longevity is to securing a strong legacy. When we talk about players who are playing to this present day, I'd shorten the window to just 3 seasons. Ultimately, we can't sit back and wait for players' careers to end to then call them world class. Appreciation of current class should not be shied away from, so I'd say 3 consecutive seasons of world class output to this present day is a fair yardstick. When a player we currently value as world class has an inevitable drop off, we can then make that call on whether we were right or wrong, as hindsight is the devil when it comes to reflecting on our judgment of players. So you might be wondering, if the yardstick for being labelled world class is around a 3 season window, where does that leave the current crop of young players? For me, this is when I call players a world class talent, meaning they've got the potential to permanently withhold that label, but they haven't proven their worth over a long enough period. I am going to make one exception to this statement though, and that's for Lamine Yamal. Sometimes a player breaks through who is a complete anomaly and disrupts the norms. A few years ago it was Kylian Mbappe, and now it's Lamine Yamal. He doesn't just tick the eye test, but he's also won honours for both club and country, which most players could only dream of. So which young players are world-class talents? Well, I'd look at Doué from PSG to start with. 12 months ago most didn't even know who he was, but he's certainly on the right path to being one of the best of his generation if he carries on. That Champions League final performance was certainly unforgettable. Now this next one could be controversial, but I'd go also with Michael Olise, purely because he's only been at Bayern for 1 season. But again, I have no doubts that if he continues to perform, then he'll be right up there. What I'm trying to get at is that if a player breaks through and shines straight away, it's easy to get carried away with world-class labels. But how often do we see young players show promise, and yet it fades away? Look at Bojan Krkić for example. Some described him as the next Messi, and he ended up at Stoke. I know similar comparisons have been made with Yamal, but I'm willing to put my neck on the line with this call of him already being world class. Let me know in the comments if you agree. The last topic which I'm going to look into is stats. We're living in a time where experts discuss XG to justify a striker's place in a team when he's not scoring. Whilst most fans nowadays make up their judgment on whether a player is better than the other, purely based off of goal involvement numbers. Gone are the days where players were appreciated for simply being mavericks. You look back to Zidane, who was a joy to watch and he made the sport look easy, but his numbers were never exceptional. And so in the modern game, I'm certain you'd have many question his world-class status due to comparisons being made with other players who potentially put up better numbers. Now of course, football is a numbers game, and I do give stats plenty of thought when it comes down to labelling players world class. But I certainly believe there's more to judging players than just numbers. When we look into players' stats, I think it's crucial that we consider the standard of play, ultimately meaning the league. When Cody Gakpo was at PSV, in his last 2 seasons he achieved 66 goal involvements in 71 games, which I'd categorise as world-class stats. Since Gakpo joined Liverpool, he's definitely not been a flop, as his goalscorer numbers are respectable, and I do like him as a player. But he hasn't nailed down a position in that starting 11, the same way Salah has on the right-hand side. And I'd consider Salah world-class, so I couldn't possibly put Gakpo into the same bracket. Now I wouldn't say Gakpo is expected to replicate those exact same numbers shown before making the big move, especially as a wide forward. But there is an expectation for them to stand out from their competitors while showing that wow factor. That's what equals a world-class player. When I mention wow factor, you often hear pundits criticising Haaland by stating that he's not a great footballer but rather just a goal scorer. And I will say that he's not the best on the eye to watch, but scoring is an art in itself, and Haaland would have to half those goal scorer numbers for me to consider his world-class status. And even then, his numbers would still be respectable. If you want strikers that can tick all boxes, I look at the likes of Luis Suarez and Robert Lewandowski. Whoever they played for, they delivered, and they were able to produce these exceptional numbers at the highest level, whilst having an expansive goal catalogue, winning trophies and ticking the longevity box. That's what makes them not only world-class but legends of the game. So in this segment I've only covered attackers so far, and that's purely because I feel like it's in these areas of the pitch where the biggest disputes arise, when trying to connect stats with world-class claims. Isn't it interesting how the use of stats is not so heavily mentioned when we look at players who are positioned within the defensive third? In the Premier League, I'd say the majority of football fans would say that Virgil van Dijk is currently the best defender. But most fans wouldn't be able to give justifications to this statement based off of key stats, such as aerial and ground duels won, interceptions, or even clean sheets. The judgment would purely be based off of the eye test. Moving on, if I asked you, who's the better goalkeeper between Courtois v Donnarumma? I doubt you delve into save percentages or high claims achieved. You'd go off what you saw in those matches. Stats are seemingly of less importance when we look across the defensive third. And so this is the reason why I feel like there's more agreements than disagreements when it comes to labelling players world class. So ultimately, it's natural that the attackers are under more pressure when it comes to output, but I wouldn't say that a player is ranked lower than the other, simply because they have, let's say, 5 less goal involvements at the end of the season. I believe we should also consider a player's all-round game, whether it be they work hard out of possession, they showcase flair, they step up in big matches, or they're just simply tactically flexible. So now I'm going to delve into the current players who I believe are world class, and there's certainly been some tough calls involved. I stand by my views that we can't have too many players being called world class, but I also don't believe it should be restricted to just naming the best 11 in the world. Those players are who you could label as generational talents within their respective position. So I'm going to turn this into a game which you guys can do yourself, and please do share your results in the comments. I'm going to select a world-class squad which makes up for 33 players, meaning on average you can have no more than 3 players per position, which I'd say is reasonable. However, you can have just 1 player representing a certain position and 5 in another. There are no restrictions other than it can't be any more than 33. Before I start, I want to again briefly mention Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi. Both are still playing and both are still putting up excellent numbers. They have gone beyond world class in their careers, but they've naturally slowed down at the ages of 37 and 40. Although they're not at the peak of their powers anymore, I still believe they're world class, but I will exclude them off of this list as I believe it is a new generation and their involvement is not necessary as their legacies are already secured. So here is my list. As you can see, I've got some positions which are more overloaded than others. Now I'm not going to go through each player as I believe many don't need justifying, but there are a few which could be questioned. Additionally, I have made another graph with players who I feel just missed out for different reasons, so we'll go into that afterwards. So the first player I'd like to justify is Saliba, as he's the only one on this list to not win silverware. But he's performed to such a high level over the past 3 seasons that I genuinely believe that he would start for any team in the world. It goes back to the definition of world class, being amongst the best in the world, and I believe he's within this bracket. Carvajal is another one you could question, but he was the best right back in the world for me when Real Madrid won the double, and although he has just come back from an injury layoff, he returned in the latter stages of last season, and it was as if he never left. Alphonso Davies is currently ruled out with a bad knee injury, but he still played over 30 games last season, and he's been a constant threat down that left-hand side over many seasons, whilst winning multiple domestic titles. Midfielders, wingers and strikers I'm all happy with, but I'll now go through some of the players who I was tempted to add in, and it was tough leaving some out. In this new graph you can see, I've had to separate them into different sections because my reasonings are so vast. There are a few players on here who I believe are world-class worthy, but I won't say who that is because it would just be cheating, and I simply had to pick my best 33-man squad. So I'm going to start with the age bracket, and I like to state that, for me, all of these players have been world class. That's already secured. But I just don't believe they're as impactful nowadays. I can't go off players' legacies. Looking at their minutes and starts was a big factor for me. Moving on to the injury section, and it's self-explanatory. They've missed too many games over the past few seasons to be considered right now. But their talent is undeniable. I really wanted to include Frenkie de Jong, but starting only 29 league games across 2 seasons is not something I can get behind, and I hope he returns back to full fitness. Musiala is a player who I feel has star quality, but last season he only started 20 games, and the one before it was 21, and now he's got a horrible injury, so I hope he recovers back to his best. Now the close call section gave me a headache. Koundé and Bastoni were the ones I battled with on Saliba, and I wouldn't argue against anyone who included them. Cucurella has had a fantastic 12-month period after winning the Euros and the Club World Cup, but it wasn't long ago that everyone was saying that he was a flop signing for Chelsea. So I'd like to see Cucurella continue his form for another season before giving him a world-class tag. The midfield options are stacked, so tough decisions had to be made. McAllister winning the domestic league and a World Cup puts him close, and if his 3rd season at Liverpool is a success, then I feel like he'll make the cut. Caicedo and Rice, I have no doubt will make it too if they carry on, and I feel for Bruno Fernandes because I believe in a better team, he might storm into the 33-man list. In attack, the player which will raise the most eyebrows is Ousmane Dembele, and if you go off recency bias then he'd certainly make the cut, but if you look throughout his career he's very much been an up and down player, and that doesn't match the criteria for me. He never set the world alight at Barcelona, and he was heavily in the shadow behind Mbappe before last season. Without question, Dembele stepped up to the plate and discovered a world-class season, but I'd like to see him replicate those same levels next season before placing him in the 33-man squad. Now with Bukayo Saka, I simply had to choose between him and Kimmich on my list, and I went for the more proven and accomplished player right now. Saka has been brilliant for club and country over recent years, and he certainly passes the eye test, but he's just not ahead of the other wingers in my squad as it stands. With the strikers, Isak and Gyökeres are the ones who are very close. Isak is looking for a big move this summer and Gyökeres has already got it. I think in 12 months' time I'll have to find a way to get the pair in. That is if they prove themselves when faced with huge media pressure. Then I've got the outside shout section, and I feel like most of these players, if they had luck with big moves, would have made the cut or could have made the cut. And I think out of them, Dumfries is the closest one. Now the last section goes to the players who I would say are world-class talents, but consistency and longevity is a criteria which I hold very highly. And these players haven't had the time to prove it yet. Foden is different from the rest as he's a bit older. He showed world-class form when he won Premier League Player of the Season in the 2023-24 season. But that completely faded afterwards in the season that just passed. And this is exactly why I value consistency before labelling players world class. Florian Wirtz, I just feel like he's not in that bracket just yet, not based off ability, but because of timing. If he can replicate his form in the Premier League with Liverpool, then he'll be in. But it just feels a bit premature to say he's world class right now. The likes of Elise, Doué and Palmer are all going to inevitably join the world class list, in my opinion. And Palmer and Doué's performances in major finals pushes that argument a lot further. But Elise and Doué have only been contracted to an elite club for 1 season, whilst Palmer had a major dip throughout last season, although he did turn it around nearer the end. So I simply just want them all to tick off the consistency box, and then I'll comfortably call them world class. So this has certainly been the longest video which I've made so far on the channel, but it's been a topic I've enjoyed looking into. I think it's fair to say that we'll never reach a stage where all football fans around the world agree on labelling players world class, but there is certainly a criteria list which I feel we should all consider. Stats are of course important, especially for attackers, but I think we should also judge players on what we see with our own eyes, rather than just making the final call based on a player's ratings, shown by football sites and apps. On a personal level, longevity and consistency will always remain the most important criteria to accomplish, whilst having a hefty trophy collection brings the icing on the cake. Please do let me know in the comments if you feel like I've missed out on any areas which should be considered. And again, I want to hear your thoughts on my world-class list, whilst I'd like to see the ones that you create. As always, thank you for watching.